So just to say a few words about the Parliament Prize project that has been co-organized by OBC Transeuropa. It's a project that aims to promote and explore better the role of EU institutions. There was already an EDUKit that we did together as like CEJI and OBC Transeuropa that we strongly recommend to take and have a look at. It's on the anti-discrimination policy and the role of the European Parliament in developing it. We had already one webinar on sexist hate speech, and we're going to have another one tomorrow on anti-Semitic hate speech. So a series of webinars exploring different forms of hate speech. And with Facing Facts, we at CEJI run Facing Facts. It's been running for 7 years, and we, through education and advocacy, aim to tackle hate crimes and hate speech in Europe. That's a very short introduction, and I'm really getting to the end of the part where I keep talking, and you'll have a chance to share more of your work. So just before we get into specifically anti-migrant and anti-refugee hate speech and this whole phenomena, it's important to mention and clarify what we all mean by hate speech. There are plenty of different definitions. There is no universal one single definition that's been accepted everywhere. And with Facing Facts, we promote a wider definition also in our hate speech course that deems hate speech anything to be any communication in a given context that can be potentially harmful to an individual or a group based on two or more of their characteristics. And the reason we keep this quite broad is to really be able to measure or grasp the harm of hate speech. Now, in contrast to that, the legal definition is much stricter and more narrow. It has to be. So we rely on the 2008 framework decision, which deems hate speech illegal when it is publicly inciting to hatred or to violence, also denial or gross trivialization of genocide and mass murder. So this is just to give like an idea that there is, of course, as we just briefly talked about it before this webinar, large amount of speech that falls into the gray area, that those that are in between that might be legal, but it's still not okay. So we're going to discuss all this and even more in the coming around 40 minutes. So we have a good time. We are not too restricted, although probably we could speak about this for more hours. So maybe we can start with the first question, and then I will just keep an eye on the chat function. Again, feel free to submit any questions there. So in your experience with your work, what are the current trends that you perceive in anti-migrant and anti-refugee hate speech and hatred in general? Has it been decreasing, increasing? Do you already see some connections with the upcoming European elections? What's your experience or insight?
To start? Okay. I think what is very telling is already that, like, by advertising this webinar on anti-migrant hate speech, what followed were a lot of like hate comments, or also comments of like, maybe certain like, skeptical comments, let's say, and hateful comments, to not just generalize. This is already telling, I think, for a trend of like increasing hate, the normalization and accepting of hate speech, which is very risky. And I think what also needs to be mentioned, it's not just an increase that we see in hate against migrants, expressed against migrants, but we also see a very strong increase of hate against those who support migrants. Be it financially supporting NGOs like PICUM, or actively, and like the threats and the level of threats are also increasing. So we do have, like, in our network, we have a network of about 160 organizations, mostly across Europe. And in most countries, I mean, levels are different, but in most countries, our members face certain level of hate. Many member organizations involve migrants themselves, but others are not necessarily migrants, but working for migrants' rights, especially undocumented migrants' rights. And there are threats now, like, going up to like rape threats or even death threats, or threats that to harm people or families. So we definitely see an increase in hate, but also like an increase in the normalization and acceptance, and that's probably the tricky thing. And one thing I would also differentiate is systematic hate spread by, for instance, policymakers who want to gain voters, and hate that is more through like acceptance and normalization, not necessarily recognized as hate in the general public and everyday discourse. And just to give a few examples, I mean, like, for instance, we work as PICUM works particularly for undocumented migrants' rights. So those are obviously people who are no voters. So they're very easy targets for scapegoating, for like systematic hate. So policymakers use them as a threat for othering the possible threats and to ensure their voters that they're going to control protect citizens from a potential threat. That triggers a lot of hate against undocumented migrants systematically. Then, of course, we see a lot of discourse, and we'll later speak about also academics and civil society. It's often not really considered hate. So even like words, we're very sensitive about terminology, and PICUM is known for the terminology work. And for instance, we think that it's tricky, for instance, to speak a lot about like host countries, because like that's obviously not hate speech, and it's frequently used by academics, by policymakers, by people who speak about migrants' rights. And because host country already implies the migrant is the guest, possibly temporarily, might not have the same entitlements as the citizen, and that provides easy grounds for like othering a certain group. So those who might use it might be completely innocent and unaware, but then those who want to systematically use hate speech, if these kind of terms are normalized and these kind of images, the framing, the associations we make from using those terms just as normal, they then have like an easy, it's quite easy then to grow hate and
And just before moving on to whether you see the same or you see the same trends, Sarah, so does PICUM have any proposal on what could be the good word for host countries instead that could benefit or contribute to a better discussion, or not yet?
We were just trying to avoid it. Sometimes we just, if we have to, like in the context, if we have to somehow mention where somebody is coming from, then we maybe say like this migrant staying currently in Germany, coming from whatever country.
Avoiding
exactly. There's many ways to go around it without even like creating this.
It's a simple thing that everyone can do.
Yeah.
And do you see the same, Sarah, in your work? The same trends and intensifying hatred and
I think the topic of hate speech is very hard to measure, and whether it increases or not, I think it's very difficult to understand that, particularly because of what you mentioned, Julia, about this distinction that we make between racist speech, hate speech as a broader concept, which is about harmful discourses, it's about problematic terminology, as we talked about, but it's also about the incitement to hatred aspect. And we see that quite much as a spectrum. Even though we can talk about them as separate phenomenon, you can definitely see how increasing use of criminalization rhetoric, increasing use of security threats, which may not incite directly violence against migrants, refugees, and undocumented migrants, they contribute to an environment which means that violence against them is somehow more legitimate because they are a public threat, because they are potential terrorists, because they are potential rapists. So all of these broader discourses which may not fit such a high burden of proof, which amounts to incitement to hatred, discourses around that, I think they contribute to this idea that somehow a certain section of society, and we can talk about migrants, but also, as we talked about before, there's other groups, ethnic minority groups, that also fall into this increasingly vulnerable and society, which therefore individuals feel more justified to talk badly of, whether it meets the burden of incitement to hatred or violence, or whether it means just portraying them as a threat. So it's important always to not look at hate speech in a legal sense in isolation, and rather look at the broader context that sits around that. And that broader context is one, especially when we're talking about politicians and policymakers, as you said, of increasing securitization, of the increasing need to manage migration as if it is inherently a problem in itself, threats to public order, criminalization of undocumented illegal migrants. when you portray a set of people as threats, then it's obviously more legitimate to talk about them in a negative way. The other trend I would talk about is accountability and a lack of accountability for hate speech, particularly when it meets the burden of incitement to hatred or when it meets a broader standard of racism. So maybe not necessarily inciting anyone to perpetrate any violence against groups, but portraying negative stereotypes, things that are linked to racial identity and other things. And I think that those are linked. When it comes to politicians, I'm very interested in that and the role of institutions in not just perpetrating incitement to hatred, which we have seen in the European context at national and European level, examples of incitement to hatred, but also racist violence in terms of like making stereotypes about Roma against refugees specifically, and the lack of accountability for these. And even when, and I think we can talk about this later, we have put in place some form of measures in place, whether these measures are used, whether there are political consequences for policymakers or for politicians or any at the national or European level, but the fact that we don't have the implementation of sanctions against this, therefore makes it much more difficult to present counter-narratives, softer projects and support of better discourses of diversity, because we have people in positions of power perpetrating these either racist standards or inciting hatred themselves. And the lack of accountability, I think, is key to understand this, how hate speech increasingly spreads as a threat, particularly against refugees and undocumented migrants, where we have a legal framework which reiterates that they are somehow not belonging.
I think like also about the point of not seeing it in isolation and putting it in the context. It's also very important to not seeing the hate against migrants, refugees, or Roma, or in isolation, but putting it in the context of like that it's just used generally for the systematic spreading of hate by policymakers for basically agendas that are really like anti-rights agendas. So meaning it's not just, we should not just consider this is hate against the minority, it's about the minority, it's about us, it's about our democracies. It's putting our democracies at risk, and I will probably come to the role of the institutions, but it's really putting our democracy at risk, and even like looking beyond Europe. I mean, we look at Europe today in this webinar, but like if we speak about trends, and if we look beyond Europe, we see these trends globally. Just today we got the news about the election of a fascist in Brazil, and Bolsonaro, he was in his electoral campaign, he was using a lot of hate speech. He was very systematically singling out minorities, different minorities, and like building up his constituency with using hate. So I think we really have to see this as a threat to our societies, and not treat it about, it's about this minority, and maybe there were some incidents, and maybe it's partially justified. Like often you have this kind of normalization, this reasoning, people are like using arguments, but there was this and that incident, so we shouldn't. It's no surprise that people are now like building up these kind of attitudes. No, we should think about our societies as a whole. It's a threat for all of us in our democracy.
I think, and especially when Sarah, you mentioned accountability, and whenever it comes to hate speech, I also feel like the word responsibility, this thing that people forget when they're just sharing things online. I think of the other person on the other side of the monitor, the screen, and also just like really taking responsibility for what we say, or what we write, or what we share, and also what we say if we're policymakers, or if we're just think of the systematic hate as well, when we can reach a wider public more easily. So in terms of anti-migrant hate speech, we also already touched upon the impact on society, and also just like how it becomes more normalized and more accepted. When it comes to victims and targets of anti-migrant hate speech, I'm thinking maybe, Elisabeth, you in your network work more closely with victims, or do you provide any support? Do you hear back from them, how it impacts them?
I mean, like one thing we work on definitely is through our network as well, is definitely, of course, the rights of victims, but also like the impact of an environment, or of like this environment of like possibly facing threats. And this is against the migrants, but again also against those who support them. So what we see is also this trend of criminalization of migrant supporters, which is normalized, which is based on EU legislation in different countries, where migrant supporters are then criminalized, either just harassed or formally persecuted for helping undocumented migrants, refugees, and this is by far not as often believed. Just people who pull out people from the water, or like or maybe in a border area where it's tricky, but this is also about general help, like providing food, providing assistance, providing even maybe some medical aid. So we see that like a lot of normalization is also because there's legislation allowing this criminalization, a lot of normalization that it is right to make people face charges who help undocumented migrants. That's also a trend. So we're kind of like working with our partners and also like at institutional level as well as like our civil society network also against this criminalization of assistance. And of course also like we have many partners in our network. We work like with victim rights organizations, and we highlight that also of course every victim of like attacks or crimes, regardless of residence status, has a right to protection and justice. So access to justice is also a key aspect in our work.
And now that you mentioned legislation, this brings me to the next question. What do you think legislation is to create change? Is there any way that legislation can be pushed? Do you work on that as well? And that book, I'm trying to open up the conversation more to the role of other institutions, particularly on EU level, but also kind of anything to add on member states and national organizations. So how do you see where, just really noting what we discussed here before or talked about before, that hate speech is the symptom and not the disease itself, so we have to treat the disease. So how do you see what has been done so far by institutions? Where are the gaps? Where can or should it be or must it improve? What is your experience?
Yeah, I can go if you like. And so just speaking from an EU level perspective, you've already mentioned we have the framework decision on hate speech, which is very important, and it was a very significant prominent document at the time because many member states didn't have legislation against hate speech, racist speech at the time, and hate crime, so that wasn't important. We still have some member states that don't have legislation against that, and we wait for infringement proceedings from the European Commission for the implementation of that. I think, again, coming back to this point about we should not see such legislation in a vacuum. So it's very good that there is legislation against hate speech, and I think it's one important step to combating an issue. It shouldn't be the only step though, and there's only limited amounts that we can do with legislation if it is not implemented, if they're not followed up with sufficient sanctions, if it is also not the ethos behind that legislation is not extended to all other forms of policy making. So we're talking here about anti-migrant hate speech. There's one thing to say you should have access to justice and you should have protection for migrants against hate speech, but in another sense have immigration law in your national level country, which means that you may be at risk of deportation if you report a hate crime. So these gaps in a policy implementation framework in many national member states and also at the EU level make it very difficult to actually have a full implementation of the rights of migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, I would say. And the same has been the case for Roma as well. So we have laws that seemingly protect and provide criminal remedies for victims of hate speech. However, you have an immigration framework, which means that many people who are living under the radar, who are not legitimate in their migrant status, they might be susceptible to detention and then for deportation. So therefore, they become an illegal black hole, which means that they cannot really report things because they don't want to be visible to the authorities. There have been a few solutions put forward and ideas of Chinese walls to be put between immigration services and criminal services in many member states, but this has not necessarily been followed in many member states. The UK, for example, does not necessarily have a fully implemented firewall between, or Chinese wall between immigration services and criminal support services. So this directly comes in jurisdiction to the Victims' Rights Directive, which does have a protection for nationality. So you should be able to get your rights as to support as a victim of crime, even though you aren't necessarily not having a legitimate legal status. So if you're a migrant without documents, for example, you should technically, under the Victims' Rights Directive, be able to access your rights to support as a victim of crime. However, in the framework decision, this only covers race, ethnicity, color, and religion, and so therefore you have a gap, which means that necessarily, the legislation doesn't necessarily protect you on the basis of nationality. So you have legal gaps, which then are even wider at the space of implementation, and I think this is the first step to sort of make sure that you have consistency across all of your legislation, because there are always going to be gaps at the implementation stage anyway. So if you already from the start have gaps at the implementation level, at the legislative level, then you're going to have real concrete issues and access to rights for certain groups. Obviously, the EU is based on this distinction between EU citizens and non-EU citizens. So we don't necessarily protect the rights and non-discrimination against non-EU citizens, because that is not what the EU is about. However, when we're talking about crime and the need to protect victims of crime, if you don't do that, if you don't provide for specific measures for these, then these people are going to be more susceptible to violence, and you have in your legal framework a gap there which you are exacerbating. So in answer to the question, legislation is important, but it must be consistent legislation. If your ethos and your priority is to protect victims of crime, then you need to reflect that as your #1 priority in your legislation, and then follow it through with your implementation, which we have seen is not the case at the EU level. And therefore, it has consequences for the everyday situation of migrants when it comes to hate speech, hate crime, and in access to justice in any of those situations.
Yeah, maybe to add to this, I mean, the implementation gaps are also definitely a key issue. So, Sarah, you mentioned the Victims Directive. So that's also key for us, for PICUM, because it really grants rights to every victim, regardless of residence status, in a non-discriminatory way. But what we see at member states level is that legislation is sometimes not properly implemented, or there's even very little awareness about it. So what PICUM does also, like, we try to work closely with those organizations on the ground in those member states to help implement relevant directives and legislation, and also to help make authorities aware. So sometimes it's really about awareness, in addition to the consistency issue, of course. And I think it's also important, when we think also of the parliament elections next year, it's important to also keep very basic rights of the European Union in mind, like the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. Like, of course, there's the freedom of expression, but then there's also an article on non-discrimination, and like there's like rights, that are the main pillar of the union, and like they're just often disregarded. And then again, we have this kind of discrepancy between the legislation and the way the discourse is shifting in those institutions. So of course there's multiple initiatives. There's maybe also to mention the European Parliament Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup that is also trying to fill up this gap to address different issues, also borderline issues that are like relevant also to hate speech and migrants' rights, anti-racism. And then at the European Commission level, there's also the EU high-level group on combating racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. I think it was founded in 2016, and it also aims to bring in civil society at least. But again, then like, you don't really obviously see this kind of consistent implementation and realization of this legislation. And other legislation, which is of course also highly debated, is legislation when it comes to like possibly restricting hate online. So there's the this code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online by the Commission, which was agreed by like Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and YouTube that follow it. But again, there's of course a lot of debate about the freedom of speech or no consistent implementation. There's a lot of like issues also with, for instance, social media networks that then again don't necessarily have to follow EU legislation, or because all they're based in the US, so there's still a lot of like there are gaps to fill.
So yeah, that's a very good overview, I think, for everyone on what's happening at an EU level, and also the main problems with legislation, consistency, implementation, or little awareness. And we also, as we talked about, or as I was listening, you also mentioned civil society organization member states. So I wonder, on top of, or to complement what's happening on an EU level or what needs to be improved there, what can other stakeholders do, from individual activists to CSOs, academia, journalists, all different stakeholders do, as we at Facing Facts believe that we all have a role to play. So when it comes to tackling these problems, we all need to come together. How do you see the role of other organizations in this?
I think there are many, as we see, it's a broad phenomenon, so there are many ways you can address hate speech as an individual phenomenon, and then on the structural institutional level. In terms of the individual level, I think particularly at the grassroots level, it's really important to recognize the work done by NGOs and collectives, groups of activists to support victims of online hate speech, but also hate crimes more broadly. And I think they do really important work there to try and fill a gap between these access to justice that we've seen, those that when the state does not provide sources of support for victims. I think that's a really important thing to focus on. Also, not just in terms of when we're looking at migrants and particularly in their undocumented position, which is very vulnerable. There are organizations which provide border support services, housing, access to legal services, which I think is really important. It's not just about like individual cases of hate speech, but also the broader situation that migrants and refugees, particularly undocumented migrants, face. And I think that's a really important, holistic, well-rounded base of support that sometimes is not provided by the state. I think at the national and local level, it's really important to look at the documentation work that CSOs take place in, which is like looking at what is the phenomenon of hate speech, how much is it being used online, how much do political actors use it, and actually recording that, publicizing that, and speaking out against that, which often you don't have consistent mechanisms or coherent mechanisms on the state level to actually record those incidents, because usually they're linked to criminal procedures, and often we don't see everything as hate speech at the criminal level. Therefore, we have a whole range of damaging and racist speech that is not recorded. So CSOs do really important work to document that. And then more broadly, I think advocacy is key, and I think that's where organizations like PICUM, ENAR and CEJI also do a good work to sort of try and bring together national level CSOs with their examples and with their on-the-ground knowledge, but take those examples and try and bring them to either national level or European level. Because I think we can very much, as I was saying, we can very easily have a legislation against that, but if you don't have any accountability, if you don't have any recourse, especially when political actors are making these comments about undocumented migrants, fueling this environment of hate, then what do you do when you don't have accountability? And then we have very clear role, I think. We have a role to communicate to the heads of political institutions, to hold them to account for this. We have a role to call for more longer-term holistic procedures. For example, in the European Parliament, they have a rule against racist hate speech, or racist speech, racist, defamatory, and I think it's xenophobic speech in the European Parliament, but we have no mechanism by which this is, these sanctions are put into place. So it's the role of civil society to call for that, to monitor when there has been an individual case of damaging racist hate speech in the Parliament, and call for why has there not been a response at the political level. So I think on those three sort of basis, we can have a holistic response to hate speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe to also to add, like, I mean, there's already there are quite a few resources already and like initiatives, and I think what is key is also like linking and building partnerships, so that like partnerships with migrant and refugee organizations or anti-racism organizations are not doing this kind of like on their own. Sometimes also their voice is not, especially when it's about like the skeptical audiences, the NGO voice is not the most heard, or not the most, unfortunately, not the most credible for some audiences. So there's, for instance, some reporting associations like the Ethical Journalism Network. They have already done a lot. Like they have done simple guidelines specifically on reporting on migration for journalists. So very simple guidelines on like, how do I check my facts? How can I check if my language is neutral? And it's actually something even academics can do as well. Like earlier we spoke about this one example of the host country, which is obviously not, there's no bad intention with this term, or not, it's not necessarily hate speech, of course. But then like how academics who aim to provide factual neutral research, they themselves can of course question like their language, or possibly use such guidelines like the Ethical Journalism Network provides, that is maybe mainly tailored for media, but can be used by anyone. And like, am I really neutral in what I'm putting together if I aim to be neutral? So I think there's always the risk of falling into the trap of like, taking over this mainstream discourse of policymakers. We all know that like civil society is, and migrants themselves, of course, not to forget, we are much less quoted in the mainstream media, or like given a voice, than the, let's say, policymaker, or at the council meeting at EU level. Some conclusions are like of the council are like in all EU languages, published in through short articles across the EU in the media. But then a certain language persists there. You hear all the time about this border control, securitization that we mentioned. It's a very dominant language. But like, how can we empower other voices, civil society, especially migrants themselves, to be a voice? And how can we use possibly guidelines or build partnerships with those who provide useful tools? There's, for instance, also the organization Article 19 that is about freedom of speech, and they have done work on hate speech. There's other partners, they're like partners or possible partners who don't necessarily have, direct link to migrants. I think another initiative that could be useful is also to see who are the credible voices for the audiences to reach. We speak a bit too much in our own bubbles as civil society. We reach those who understand us in our language. We have to revise our own language, and like messages and formats. Or we suddenly get those who are maybe haters, who interfere and like leave bad comments on our Twitter feeds. But like, how do we get the big group in between, those that like are also like the same group that our opponents, the populists, also battle to win? So how do we reach them? Who can be the champions that we use, or the voices that reaches them? Like, can we possibly, even with service providers, or some police department somewhere through our members, or champions, like maybe there are migrants who are like famous migrants, like in sports and in football, or like who can we give a voice? Actors, or who can we give a voice to raise awareness among much larger audiences that we don't often get to talk to, about how easily hate is spread and how easily it's built, and like how to raise awareness of not falling into this trap.
I think that also leads us to the next question and part of the answers. Just wanted to ask a bit about any successful initiative or program or NGO that you've heard about, what seems to work in your opinion. That will also, I'm just checking the time as we're getting closer to the end of the webinar. If there are any questions that you want to submit our participants, then feel free to do it now, and then we'll be able to quickly address them before the very end. I really like your point about also empowering voices and reviving their own language. What we've been struggling with the hate speech course is how do we make people care? How do we, really create awareness and empathy and make them involved or feel involved in this issue? That's also one of the quick issue that we need to tackle as civil society organizations. So when it comes to any other successful initiative that you've heard of, or what seems to work in your opinion, where can we improve to better combat this phenomenon? And now I'm really opening it up as we, as society, as civil society organizations, as individuals, even as European citizens or organizations, what do we need to do next to do better?
Maybe just to give a few practical examples from our network that we are aware of that at least reach certain segments of audiences that should be key. Like, for instance, our Spanish moderator Coche, they have produced a series called Inmigracionalismo, and they raise awareness about the sensationalism through like sarcasm and irony in videos. So like they kind of like show how in the newsroom something gets through because it's sensationalist, how language is blown up, and it's like the videos are done in a way so that they reach a much wider public, and they also translate it into English. So this is something that could work. Then of course there are generally some reports that inform that might be also useful for academics or people who are already aware generally of the issue, or like knowledgeable about migrants issues, but maybe have not really considered how easily they can, the links of hate. And for instance, there's a new report on anti-migrant hate speech now that was published by the Quaker Council on European Affairs. It just came out now in June. So it kind of outlines a bit what we discussed, the existing legislations, the gaps, what should be done, a bit what we've discussed here today. And then another, actually also a Spanish member of us, SOS Racismo, they have done something that's also very needed, monitoring and reporting. Monitoring cases of discrimination and hate. And one key issue is, of course, that these cases are also not reported. But as much as they were reported within their own network, they have monitored them and pulled them together in a report, and also once launched one of these reports here in the European Parliament in a debate. So they also brought this from like Spain to the EU level. So these are initiatives that also civil society organizations at national level and member states can do. And of course, there's always like, it sounds like it's a lot of time investment, resources that many civil society organizations don't necessarily have. But if you then maybe find the right partners who can support you, also looking kind of like outside of the migrant rights organizations, more like in society, are there any institutions, or like we said before, media associations who are aware of the risks, who also raise awareness through training materials among journalists? Maybe they want to be a partner or something. Or with whom can you monitor? Or maybe police or some authorities are actually interested in getting this data because they don't necessarily gather it or don't have the same resources from civil society. So maybe there's an interest. Where do we find an interest and the information we can provide to fill those gaps?
In terms of successful initiatives, I think, as Elisabeth said, I think you really have to look at the context and then determine from that what are the gaps and what needs to be done. And I think some of the best and most successful initiatives in civil society have looked at that. Where is the gap in the legal framework? Where is the gap in the access to support for victims? And how do we fill that as civil society? So in the same way, we have some civil society, particularly in Ireland, which has that complete gap in recording hate speech and hate crimes, decided to set up their own reporting mechanisms. That's the iReport website, which has been pretty much the substitute for state data on hate crime and hate speech. And I think that in the context of there being nothing is super important. In different countries, they face different challenges. So in the UK, there was a real need for collaboration at the level of police and civil society, particularly because there were many feelings of the fact that police were not necessarily targeting particular issues of hate speech and hate crime, and therefore there were actual implemented agreements by civil society on behalf of Muslim and Jewish communities, which were putting in place cooperation between police and civil society in how to target hate crimes and hate speech. And I think that was very interesting for that purpose and in that context. At an EU level, I would really have to stress that we have really failed to hold our political representatives to account for the speech that they use, which is either incitement to hatred or extremely damaging and racist stereotypes. And that has really been, for me, I think, the root of all hate speech, because it legitimizes it. And it's one thing to talk about how we combat hate speech from an anonymous individual sitting behind their computer versus a politician which has a potential reach of millions, if we think about how it's reported, who watches it directly, how it's recorded into the history of the European Parliament, for example. I think the best and most successful initiatives I can think of there are really high-profile attempts to actually call that member of parliament or that politician to account, to myth-bust about what was wrong about what was said, and then actually call for specific concrete measures of what should be done in that situation. So ENAR, which is the network on the Roma rights, they have also from many individual specific examples of hate speech, whether it's against Roma or against migrants, have written letters, have made very public statements in the media and on their own platforms to actually directly call for a response to individual cases of hate speech. Often we don't necessarily get the response that we ask for, but that is our key and baseline level job, is to actually say, you have just said this thing, this is damaging for this reason, and these are the implications. So please, how can we have the sanction? How can we have the recognition of the harm that this has caused? And I think although we don't always see positive results, in some cases we have. So in the last months, we have had a poster which was published here in Brussels, which really has perpetration of Islamophobic stereotypes in this managed migration discourse, which probably would not necessarily meet a barrier of incitement to hatred, but definitely promotes very racist, Islamophobic discourses, anti-migrant discourses, with an underlying idea that migration is inherently bad. And I think when we don't call that to account, then we lose half the battle. And one successful attempt in campaigning in mainstream media and also in media here in Brussels was to say, this is problematic, we will not allow the European Parliament to perpetrate these discourses, and you must take it down, which is something that we achieved. So I would say it's very successful also to look at like what are the gaps, what do we need to combat here, and also make that public, as we've said.
Thank you so much for the whole conversation. I'm looking at the time. It's 45, but if you're happy to extend it for 5 minutes, I will just read one or two questions that we can address briefly. One of it is asking what could be done to counter hate speech in the context of the next EU elections. I think we're just coming to that. And the other participant is asking, perhaps I missed this, but you mentioned going outside our own bubble. How exactly do you propose we do that? Can we counter this? Cynic, but for the opposite party, we are often incredible and biased by our own fanatic beliefs. So how we counter this? I think these are very good closing questions in terms of next steps. How do we get out of our bubble? How do we counter being labeled as fanatics for what we stand for? And what do we do about countering hate speech with the next European elections? If you have a few thoughts to share, also as closing remarks.
Yeah, maybe I take the last one, is going out of the bubble, because it might have been my words, I guess. So just to emphasize, this is actually about finding these right partners, these champions that I said. For instance, like seeing if we have certain audiences, it's not about like trying to reach the complete, like those who send the most hateful messages, but maybe more those in the middle who are a bit, unsure what side to take, or a bit skeptical, have contradicting information. I think we need to see who are credible voices in their communities that are that they listen to. So this might be somebody who is, for instance, I don't know, an actor, or it might be somebody in a more local community. It might be like a police department supporting something, or it might be like a sports star who has a migrant background, him or herself. So I think that there's to also avoid this maybe these kind of patronizing NGOs, or these overly correct, politically correct NGOs, or as it was mentioned here, fanatics, to avoid this sort of labeling or this view, and to not just speak in our own languages, let others speak and give the voice to others, migrants themselves as well, but also others, those who have a good contact with our communities, who maybe also who understand the impact. This is about all of us, this is about our democratic values, this is about our local communities, this is about our national communities, this is about our European community, and we even mentioned the trends at global level earlier. So I think it is very important to have a multitude of voices speaking and taking on messages in different formats, and not just like the NGOs speaking themselves, or just sending another press release, or just condemning something that was said, and by doing that actually repeating something negative, but really trying to build other positive narratives that we see that reflect the realities on the ground we have in our networks of people who deal with migrants on a day-to-day basis, and then see who are in these communities the credible voices that can reach the audiences who we want to reach. And this way, we get a bit out of our bubble.
Yeah, I won't add on apart from in response to the point about being perceived as fanatics, I think it's important also to be unapologetic on our messaging. So I think in response, like one thing that is very strong about the right is that they are very unapologetic about their messages. They're simple, they're easy to communicate. And I think it should be even easier to take those approaches and apply them to discourses which are about diversity and positive discourses about the benefits of living in a diverse Europe. And I think presenting that in a positive way rather than always responding is one way to do that, and not necessarily feeling like you have to account to criticisms of being overly politically correct or things like that, and essentially just forgoing that criticism because it's not something that you feel you have to account to. And I think that's something that we don't always manage to do. We're very concerned with being technically accurate, which is always important, but very much concerned about nuance and detail, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but then also we need to always think about the level above that. So what is the broader message we're trying to convey when we're being with our very precise and technical press releases and things like that? So what is the broader narrative that we want to put forward? Linked to the EU elections, I think a lot of that work has to be done in terms of what is your message? How do you, if you're an anti-racist organization, how does that link with the ethos behind a women's group or any other partners that we've identified, and how do you mainstream those messages throughout all of those networks, and how do you mobilize people on the basis of that? So how do you get an LGBTI organization to promote your message of anti-racism, and how do you do the same thing? That in strength in numbers, I think, is something that we really need to explore. The other thing is having clear demands. So, around the EU elections, we'll put together amongst its network a series of demands that we would ask for the next parliament, also candidates in the European election. One of them is a very clear thing, to be careful about language against hate speech, to be unapologetic about your commitment to a diverse Europe, united in diversity, which are the ethos of the European Parliament as it is, and so to really demand candidates to actually fulfill those and not just respond to the negative aspects in our society, but also really put forward their vision, which is inherently related to an anti-racist vision, a pro-migrant vision, and really being clearer in what we want from our politicians about that. So we'll put forward those demands, we'll disseminate them through our network, and we'll hope that with our network of anti-racist organizations, that will be really a basis of mobilization. Yeah, playing around that issue of being unapologetic and really like putting forward a clear vision. On the flip side, I think we always have to respond to the worst case scenario, so that if there are negative instances of hate speech or racist speech in the campaign trail, the EU elections, civil society have to be mobilized to respond to that, to really call that out, but also to counter that with their own positive messages. If we see that politicians on the campaign trail are using particular statements about migration, which we find are not true or we disagree with, to be really mobilized and empowered to contradict that and in a powerful way. And yet finding ways that we can do that in a way that's communicable, that's simple, and that reaches out to this, as Elisabeth said, this mass of people that also the populists are trying to reach out to, and how do you make those messages clear and heard.
Thank you. I think it's been extremely inspiring, especially all these like practical tips and the whole discussion. So I think we'll have to stop at this point because we ran a bit over time, but I hope all our participants enjoyed it. So I would like to thank you both very much for joining us and sharing your insights and experience. And I hope all our participants found it very useful. We'll be sending you around a follow-up email, and we're going to link some of the materials and initiatives that you mentioned so that you can go into more detail, and you can follow that up as well. And then if you would like to learn more about hate speech, check out the Facing Facts online course on hate speech and also the OBC Educate on anti-discrimination policy. And we'll be back with another webinar tomorrow and some more coming in the future as well. So thank you everyone for your attention and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.